The most massive drone attack on Ukraine since the beginning of the war. 948 drones, dozens of missiles at night and in broad daylight targeting Ukrainian cities. After the disastrous start of their much-publicized spring offensive, Russian terrorists have returned to their usual tactics, waging war against apartment buildings and civilians. A miracle has happened. Putin has publicly acknowledged problems in the Russian economy and even held a series of meetings where he demanded that everything be fixed immediately. But now perhaps everything will be fixed. Treachery is creeping through Putin's ranks. The main trend of recent days is about the vision, as if on cue, of a whole group of Z-patriots who almost in unison have started to claim that their bunker leader is no longer the same and is leading Russia in the wrong direction. And how do you like that, Elon Musk? Russia has launched the first 16 Dawn satellites into space, which are supposed to replace Starlink. However, for this to happen, the Russian Federation might need more than 40 years. We will tell you about this and more in detail right now. But for now, don't forget to like this episode and let's get started. From the night and throughout the entire day yesterday, the terrorist state carried out massive air attacks on Ukrainian cities. They deliberately targeted crowded central squares and residential high-rises. As a result of the combined missile and drone strikes, there are dead and wounded. For example, in Lviv, Russian barbarians struck directly at the historic part of the city, where there are many tourists and local residents at this time. UNESCO heritage sites were damaged. A Shahed drone struck the Bernardine Monastery, a historical monument from the 16th century. There are currently 13 wounded people with injuries of varying severity in the city's hospitals. The occupiers' spring offensive is being broken by the Ukrainian Armed Forces defense, bringing only colossal losses to the Kremlin. Moreover, Ukrainian defenders have managed to launch a much more successful spring offensive themselves. Details in our report.
There are no more reserves, so Russia is planning to send all mobilized personnel from Crimea to the front. This is reported by analysts from the Institute for the Study of War. The date for the mass deployment seems to have been deliberately chosen for April Fool's Day, April 1st. At the same time, some units from the peninsula have already been sent to the mainland, according to the Ukrainian command. First and foremost, to fill the gaps caused by Russia's record losses since last week.
They really did bring in reserves, including from temporarily occupied Crimea and other directions to the Zaporizhzhia and Pokrovsk sectors. Their own reserves. This includes naval infantry and airborne units in order to accomplish their assigned tasks. Accordingly, reinforcements are coming in from the territory of the Russian Federation. But here the question is about quality.
President Zelensky also spoke about Russia launching its spring-summer offensive. Commanders of various Ukrainian armed forces units are reporting an increase in the number of assaults. However, the only result this brings is unprecedented losses among the occupiers. Sometimes more than 1,500 people per.
It had been an incredibly long, exhausting, and remarkably eventful day that truly felt as though it would continue to stretch on for an absolute eternity for every single person who was involved in the situation. For every kilometer of advance by Russian troops today, the Russian army pays with the lives of more than 3 companies.
It is precisely to cover these losses that the redeployment of Crimean units to the front is being planned. As analysts note, the new personnel are supposed to replace the wounded and reinforce the 810th Separate Marine Brigade of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, whose units are currently operating in the Kursk region and as part of the Operational Tactical Group Crimea. By the way, these same forces are now trying to advance in the Sumy region, but they do not stand out from the general background of the Russian offensive. As before, there are no results. According
to Mishavet's assessment, fighting continues in the border areas of the Sumy region along several directions. The forward units of the Russian group are trying to expand their incursion to a depth of up to 1.5 kilometers, but so far without success. At the same time, fighting is taking place along the perimeter of this incursion north of Sumy. Despite several focused attempts by Russian troops to advance southward, they have not yet managed to reach their designated lines.
The Ukrainian command notes that the Russians do not have enough forces there for a significant breakthrough. Moreover, it is from here that the Russian General Staff, among other things, draws fighters to continue the offensive in the Donetsk region. This means that the Kremlin is not betting on success in the Sumy region.
Their task today is to create conditions for establishing a buffer zone, a security zone on the Sumy front. And accordingly, we are saying that the Russians are trying to demonstrate this activity in order to distract the defense forces and possibly to force us to redeploy certain reserves, specifically to the northeastern Slobozhansky direction.
Another illustrative story of the Russian offensive remains Kupiansk. The fake capture of the city, which has been ongoing since last year, has taken on new colors. The Ukrainian armed forces managed to clear out the units that had holed up in the local hospital, and this has finally been acknowledged in Russia itself. The outcry among Russian Z military bloggers is unbelievable.
Judging by reports coming from various sources, the last authentic call signs in Kupiansk have stopped being heard on the air. May the guys rest in peace. They held out bravely until the end. Another report from Russian media. Romanov Lev. Kupiansk is almost completely occupied by the armed forces of Ukraine. Under the informational cover of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, the Ukrainian side is clearing out the remaining northern sector. The guys from the Central District Hospital have died. All of them. And this means that Kupiansk is almost entirely under the control of the Ukrainian defense forces. At the same time, the defense forces are managing to withstand the assaults of Russian troops, not just defend themselves, but also to advance, as reported by the Deep State resource. And now, not only in the southern direction.
The Ukrainian defense forces have liberated Ozern and entered Yampil in the Lyman direction. In the Oleksandrivka direction, during the ongoing counteroffensive, the Ukrainian defense forces push back the enemy. South of Novonikolayevka. So, as we can see, the Ukrainian defense forces are achieving successes along the entire length of the front line.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Ukraine's Minister of Defense, Mikhailo Fedorov, is changing the military situation in the country, transforming the armed forces of Ukraine and strengthening our country's position on the world stage. Global experts note that Fedorov is focusing on three components: a closed sky, depletion of enemy manpower, and strikes on the Russian economy. We will share all the details in the following report.
Ukraine's new Minister of Defense, Fedorov, has only been in his position for 3 months, but he has already managed to implement several shocking reforms that have caused real hysteria among the enemy.
The president has set a clear task to adapt the system to be capable of stopping the enemy in the sky, advancing on the ground, strengthening asymmetric strikes against the enemy and its economy, and making the cost of war for Russia so high that it simply cannot bear it to stop the enemy by force.
The new minister is not afraid of change and has been actively introducing technology into the army since his time at the Ministry of Digital Transformation. We
have started to systematically pursue asymmetric solutions where conventional warfare would be too costly or impossible for us. FPV drones instead of anti-tank guided missiles to destroy armored vehicles, quadcopter drones instead of scarce ammunition and artillery, Ukrainian Lancets instead of HIMARS, interceptors as part of the air defense system.
The first and most important thing is the new minister's statement that Russian losses need to be increased to 50,000 soldiers per month.
Yes, indeed. Fedorov does have the ability to create conditions so that the Russian army starts losing more people than it receives each month. That is, right now Russia is getting about 30,000, but if it starts losing 50,000, then of course this will create serious problems for Russia. And overall, from their point of view, this could put Russia on a path that leads to defeat in the war with Ukraine. The
propagandists have started having nervous convulsions because they also understand that such a goal is quite achievable, and very soon too.
Indeed, he is a competent organizer of drone production. And now he has set the task of increasing the losses of the armed forces of the Russian Federation to 50,000 per month thanks to drones. And in general, I think that's enough. A serious enemy, a serious hussar.
They especially emphasize, as I said, that Fedorov was born in 1992, so he is 34 years old, right? And from the point of view of these military correspondents, this creates very big problems. For the Russian military command, for the Russian army, since the Russian command and the Russian army are still living in the Soviet mindset. From their point of view, Fedorov is very competent. An organizer, a manager, and in general, it's hard to disagree with that. Indeed, those people who know him in Ukraine give him the same assessment here.
Another challenge that the new Minister of Defense managed to solve was finally blocking Starlink for the Russians and provoking yet another round of hysteria among Putin's lackeys.
We need Starlink to work there because certain technologies are being used that are important for us as well. They are connected to drones. There is another way to make sure that our Starlinks work while the Starlinks that appear there by other means essentially do not work. And so we are working with SpaceX to resolve this issue.
I would also like to draw your attention to the tremendous affection between Elon Musk and the scoundrel murderer, thief, and Russophobe, the current Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Fedorov, who, I remind you, calls for the killing of 50,000 Russians. And Musk is ready to give him worldwide support by blocking certain capabilities, for which, by the way, he gets paid. There should be no illusions about Starlink here. There is no such thing as Starlink being an independent company.
Moreover, at the very first Ramstein meeting, Fedorov managed to secure a record amount of support from partners for the necessary weaponry.
Today, we heard announcements totaling almost $38 billion. They are allocated specifically for air defense systems, for drones, for the development of drone assault units, for deep strikes, and for interceptor drones.
The new Minister of Defense also visits the front lines and is preparing a reform of the Ukrainian army to make justice its core value and to attract more volunteers. I
just returned from a trip to the front only yesterday morning. We met with 10 commanders of corps and brigades, including in various groupings. I asked a lot of questions regarding our vision, how we are going to address this issue, how we propose to solve it. Our task is to get information from the military working with SCCH, where SCCH is taking place. Who is returning from SCCH, who is working with the mobilized to understand the feedback.
Putin and his top officials still dream that someday loyal people will come to power in Ukraine and agree to all their demands. But instead, with every new appointment, the Russian criminal army will only get worse.
The Russian company Bureau 1000 spent 3 years preparing but finally launched the Dawn satellites into space. To obtain a satellite communication system to replace Starlink, the Russian Federation may need more than 40 years. Thus, the Russian Ministry of Defense is trying to restore access to modern communications, which were cut off by Ukraine. In the video with the launch footage, you can see the Russian device moving away from the rocket carrier's body. We see a light-colored body and equipment that, it is hoped, will provide Russians with access to the internet without the involvement of the American company SpaceX. However, it soon became clear that to fully replace Starlink, Russians would need 250 such satellites, meaning they would have to carry out another 15 to 16 launches with batches of 16 devices each. And according to experts' calculations, this could take up to 40 years. Putin acknowledged the beginning of a decline in the Russian economy. The dynamics of the main macroeconomic indicators at the beginning of 2026 turned negative, the dictator stated publicly. Our journalists looked into what lies behind this convoluted wording.
Russia is finished. Putin openly admitted that the country's economy has collapsed.
The statistics confirm this. In January of this year, Russia's gross domestic product was 2.1% lower than a year ago. Industrial production decreased by 0.8%.
The aforementioned decline in GDP was the first since 2023. Forecasts are worsening, and the prospect of further decline could lead to serious social and economic consequences.
Reports that there was an emergency meeting in the Kremlin at night with Putin, Mishustin, and, for example, the ministers from the economic bloc have become almost routine. It feels like they are constantly meeting in with a large expanded group. They discuss economic issues. You know, if you say that everything is fine with the economy, but almost every day, or at least several times a week, there are meetings in the Kremlin at night that last a long time, then probably something is wrong.
Earlier, official sources in Russia had already recorded a sharp slowdown in economic growth. In 2025, it was about 1%, which turned out to be several times lower than the authorities' expectations. The crisis has affected most sectors out of the 28 main branches of the Russian economy. 21 ended the year in the red. Raw material extraction, the metallurgical industry, and the light industry have all declined. In addition, for the first time in 15 years, food production has decreased.
Now there's an indicator that people often like to talk about. Restaurants are starting to close in Moscow. Why are restaurants closing? Because the people who usually ate at restaurants no longer have enough money to dine out. As a result, they aren't spending money at restaurants, so restaurants are missing out on profits. And on top of that, taxes are being raised. Let's not forget that in Russia, starting from January next year, taxes have been increased. The value-added tax has gone up from 20 to 22%. Fees have been raised. Other payments have been increased, and the number of beneficiaries has been reduced.
Looking ahead to 2026, the official authorities in Russia had originally projected and forecasted economic growth of over 2%. But they later adjusted their expectations downward to a more modest 1.3%.
It not only could be even lower, it could actually go negative, which is what people are talking about now. Even the Center for Economic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting that I mentioned, seemingly the brother of Russia's Minister of Defense, someone very close to those in power, they say that a recession this year is more than a real possibility. So it's not +1 or plus 0.8, it's -0.1 or -0.3, but it will be a minus. So right now in Russia, the question of whether there will be any growth at all this year is being seriously discussed.
The slowdown of the economy threatens the Russian budget with a shortfall in revenues not related to the oil and gas sector. Despite the tax reform, which provides for an increase in VAT and taxes on small businesses, according to calculations by Russian experts, the treasury may fall short by 500 billion rubles in VAT and about 200 billion rubles in profit tax.
The first quarter of the current year isn't even over yet. And already in the Russian media space, there are calls to implement a budget sequestration. What is budget sequestration? It's when they often say, that we simply cannot afford the various expenses we had originally planned, so we are going to have to cut back on these specific expenditures. But this is quite logical, and it often happens, let's say, by the month of October, when it finally becomes clear to everyone that the fiscal year is coming to an end, and the budget adopted at the very beginning of the year cannot be fully fulfilled, and accordingly, some corrective actions need to be taken. However, in this particular case, we are already hearing these kinds of statements as early as March.
A crisis in Russia could erupt at any moment, since even now most Russian regions are reporting a lack of funds even for priority spending items, such as paying contracts with servicemen who are fighting in the war against Ukraine.
The budget that was adopted essentially at the end of December, just 3 months ago, is not realistic. This was mentioned when it was being adopted, but at that time the main thing was just to pass the budget. Now they are admitting that it is unrealistic. The decision by the Moscow mayor's office to cut staff by 15% and the statement that the Committee of Ministers will reduce budget expenditures by 10%, these are no longer just words, these are real actions. And therefore, against the backdrop of these actions, it would be very foolish to say that everything is great in the economy.
Economists note that Russia is facing a typical wartime crisis: rising military spending, a budget deficit, and increasing prices for fuel and food.
It is obvious that despite the fact that there will be more oil and gas revenues in March, let's put it this way, in the sector, although that's not guaranteed either, because as a rule, these are futures. Prices have risen now, but what is coming in this month reflects the results of previous months. So it is quite possible that the planned annual deficit will be reached by the end of the first quarter.
Therefore, weak revenues, slowing economic growth, and high war expenditures will only continue to put pressure on the country's finances going forward.
Always friendly to the Kremlin, the publication Moskovsky Komsomolets launched a sharp criticism at Putin himself and predicted that the current protests by Russians could escalate into a large-scale revolution. In general, this is the main trend of recent days, an awakening almost as if on cue among a whole group of Z-patriots and until recently ardent Putin supporters, who are now practically in unison saying that Putin is not the same and is leading Russia in the wrong direction.
Our journalists looked into what is happening.
This question was raised on federal radio, and the hosts were unable to give a clear answer.
Will it turn out that in 50 or 100 years, our descendants, our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, will be ashamed to remember this conflict? The special military operation?
Tell me, please, wait, won't Ukrainian descendants feel ashamed? You're talking about our descendants, but what about the Ukrainians?
Questions like these are coming up more and more often in Russian society, and not only there. Even openly pro-Kremlin mouthpieces have begun to criticize the so-called special military operation and Putin's policies. For example, Z-blogger Ilya Remeslo has openly spoken out against the Kremlin's master, posting on his Telegram channel, "Putin must resign and be put on trial as a war criminal."
You can see what's happening right now. There is complete chaos and confusion going on. In other words, I already see clear signs of the system's impending collapse. And it's precisely because Putin is afraid to surround himself with worthy rivals, with people who could actually compete with him. That's exactly why he will lose power. And most likely, this will happen this year in 2026.
After such criticism, which was strictly within the law, the pro-Kremlin blogger Remeslo was, the very next day after his statements, sent to Psychiatric Hospital No. 3 in St. Petersburg, which during the Soviet era was also used for punitive psychiatry.
The Remeslo rebellion is not some strange nonsense, but rather one of the symptoms of a split within Russia's enlightened elite. This is evidence of a maturing opposition and sabotage within those circles. It fits into a series of similar recent events. Igor Eidman, sociologist.
One of the most widely circulated newspapers in Russia, which almost never criticized the authorities, published an article again with a sensational headline: Russia is being shaken up by banned pamphlets. The struggle with reality in this week's news. The publication criticizes recent events in the country. The slaughter of livestock, the lack of honest and open communication with the authorities, the blocking of mobile internet.
Unfortunately, the people are not the right kind. And not just according to the domestic liberal intelligentsia, some representatives of the government have roughly the same attitude toward us. By some miracle, February 24th, 2022, the authorities nevertheless decided that the people were the right kind. You can really rely on them, entrust the country to them. And we even believe that phrase about being in the same boat. But the point of unity had already been passed.
The author of the article believes that the system is so unbalanced that one part no longer understands what the other is doing. In the
Zec community, something is happening. In recent weeks, a wide variety of war correspondents and Z-bloggers have been posting increasingly uncharacteristic posts. They are calling for an end to the war, criticizing the authorities and saying that everything is heading toward a revolution or a coup d'etat. Of course, this doesn't look as vivid and rapid as with Ilya Remeslo, who really stirred up the information space. However, the behavior of an entire group of people loyal to the authorities is a more telling story that draws attention.
The Kremlin does not explain the reasons for its actions. The main example is the slaughter of livestock. In the Novosibirsk region,
the situation reached the very top in the form of a report stating that everything was proceeding according to regulatory documents, a fight against the spread of a dangerous infection. But the situation on the ground is very different from what the report says, and it looks much more like someone is covering up their own mistakes.
There's also the example of internet blocking. Moscow's economy alone loses 1 billion rubles every day. This is 3% of all revenue. Gypsy cab drivers have appeared on the streets and establishments have started installing landline phones. Online business is simply dying. No one explains anything to anyone. They just keep tightening the screws. The number of incomprehensible bans per capita has already gone off the charts.
Dissatisfaction with what is happening goes far beyond the small and humble. Z channels, conversations about a deadlock in the war, about the authorities who don't care about anyone, and about how it's time to stop the bloody meat grinder before it's too late are becoming mainstream.
All these bans resemble a trend toward destabilization in line with brochures on so-called color revolutions, which are banned in Russia. The US and Iran are one step away from a truce. Such statements began to appear in the American media after Trump said that Iran was ready to make a deal with the United States, and supposedly negotiations are underway. However, in Iran, such statements were called lies. So what is really happening between these countries, and will peace come in the coming days? We will tell you all the details right now. And don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to the YouTube channel Ukraine Today.
Is peace in the Middle East really close? The US and Iran could meet as early as this week. The publication Axios named the likely participants in the negotiations in the capital of Pakistan. The publication, citing an Israeli official, writes that US Special Representatives Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are negotiating with the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf.
There is only one option being considered, and no other alternatives were discussed. That's why, in my opinion, Trump doesn't seem very confident right now.
Mediator countries are also trying to organize a meeting in Islamabad. According to the source, a journalist, Ghalibaf, and other representatives will be present on the Tehran side and on the US side, Witkoff, Kushner, and possibly Vice President J.D. Vance. An Israeli official also reported that the meeting will likely take place at the end of this week. In addition, Trump stated that Tehran is very eager to reach an agreement, and this could happen within 5 days or even sooner. He emphasized that the latest negotiations with Iran took place the day before. In response to a question about whom the US presidential administration was negotiating with, Trump said that Iran has its representatives. And here there is an interesting nuance.
After the negotiations with Iran, Trump ordered a postponement of strikes on the country's energy infrastructure. He stated, "For the past 2 days, Washington and Tehran have held very productive and constructive talks on resolving the conflict."
But as soon as numerous media outlets reported on possible upcoming negotiations, everything was denied in Iran. Just a few hours after the statement by the American president, Iranian media announced that no negotiations had taken place between Tehran and Washington. The Iranian Foreign Ministry claims that the US president is simply trying to buy time while regional efforts to de-escalate continue.
Well, it's no secret that Trump follows a philosophy of never admitting his own guilt. Neither in everyday life, nor in politics, nor in business. You have to give your voters some kind of illusion, but in reality he was the one who sold the illusion. Or let's say, to be more objective, he fueled the illusion that exists among a certain segment of Americans. That's why he continues to communicate with them. This is exactly the same strategy he employed just before the elections and throughout the entire first year of his second term. That is precisely why this version of Trump, who simply cannot remain quiet, feels he must constantly shake up the entire information space. Consequently, he feels compelled to create these wonderful grand prospects for the future.
In addition, as they claim, political experts say that at the moment there are no convincing prerequisites for the war in Iran to end anytime soon.
As we stand here at the very conclusion of our journey, it is clear that we have finally reached the definitive point where this entire intricate process is drawing to a close. As these final moments slowly tick away, we can observe that every single element we have discussed here today will now officially, permanently, and completely come to an end. To leave and present this withdrawal as a victory, right now it seems to me that option doesn't exist.
The situation is further complicated by the fact, as The Economist writes, that the US has essentially fallen into a trap, since for Washington, out of the 4 likely scenarios for ending the war, there is no winning option left. And here are those 4 scenarios.
Negotiations are unlikely due to Iran's mistrust, but it should be noted that Trump claims they are taking place. Declare victory, but Tehran still retains leverage, continue strikes without any guarantee of results, or escalate, risking a major war.
Moreover, this rather confirms that peace in this region is not close, as well as the mutual threats between countries. For example, the day before, Trump issued an ultimatum to Iran demanding that they open the Hormuz Strait within 2 days. He stated that if Tehran does not comply within 48 hours, the US will strike and destroy various power plants, starting with the largest one. In turn, Tehran responded that if their fuel and energy complex is hit, they will strike at the US's energy, information technology, and desalination infrastructure in the region.